Prior to the pandemic, most clinical trials were conducted as on-site studies. Decentralized studies or remote studies, or virtual as they're sometimes called, were more of a novel concept. There were a few going on, but they weren't as common as what they're becoming. With the pandemic, what we had to do is look at the trials, look at the structure and the processes involved in the trials, and decide whether those could be shifted to a hybrid approach where some aspects were conducted remotely, where others may still be on site, or could we move them fully decentralized? And what we're seeing now is quite an interest in decentralized trials, but again, it's not a type of trial that can be done for every protocol, so we have to assess those case by case. In the future, we do see this being a more common practice to have both hybrid trials as well as decentralized trials, in addition to our common on-site trials. There's going to be an increase in demand for those types of studies. But there are many times that can't be conducted just due to the logistics of sample collections, whether it's blood draws or it's physician assessments needing to be conducted on participants. So we are going to see this hybrid world where sometimes we'll be doing decentralized trials, sometimes we're going to be doing hybrid studies, sometimes we're going to be doing on-site trials as we typically were. Now, with monitoring and other aspects of clinical trials, again, we're going to see some of the pandemic changes persist in our day-to-day processes, but there's others that are going to go back. There is going to be need still for on-site monitoring, as an example, and that's been outlined by FDA in their guidance that as soon as we're able to get back to normal, that some sort of on-site monitoring should still be incorporated in trials. We now have a new challenge. What would happen if somebody gets COVID? What happens if somebody already had COVID and then wants to participate in the trial? And now we're also faced with vaccinations. So we really have to look at the trials themselves and what we're looking at for endpoints to determine if we need to take additional measures or precautions in our inclusion or exclusion criteria. For example, if we're looking at immune function markers or we're looking at cold and flu studies, perhaps we need to add in provisions to test for COVID to ensure that it's not COVID and it is a cold or a flu, or maybe test to see if it is positive for flu. If it's an immunology study, then we might want to look at when the vaccinations are going to be given and will that impact the inflammatory markers that we're looking at or T and B cell responses. It's very study specific how we would assess whether or not we have to take extra measures in our inclusion-exclusion criteria. So when the pandemic broke, we were conducting many trials. Some were single-center trials, some were multi-center trials conducted both in Canada, the US, and EU. We also had a number of trials that we're looking to start up. So when the pandemic started, we really stepped back. A small core group of us got together, looked at all of our projects, looked at the protocols, where we were in those projects, and came up with a game plan within 12 hours. The biggest challenge for us, of course, was the new study starting up if they were going to be in another country such as the US or Europe. So our number one priority, given that we weren't sure what was going to happen with the borders, knowing that Europe was starting to close their borders, was to get our study product across that border. So that was the first thing that we tackled, was making sure that we got those shipments across the border, because once they were there, then we could manage the product and get it to the sites that we needed to. From there, we stepped back and looked at the protocols and what adjustments were we going to need to make to those. And for that, we started monitoring all the regulatory guidance from around the world. But the UK was the first out with it, followed by the FDA, and others followed. We've looked at that to see what we needed to implement into our protocols and how to move those studies forward. One of the challenging things during this time is the interest in COVID vaccines and other products to see what their efficacy is regarding COVID. At the same time, we have many sponsors that want to do other types of studies, whether it's women's health studies or immune function studies, exercise studies, and many others. The challenge we have is that when we're approached for these COVID studies, you don't want to introduce those at a site where we're conducting non-COVID trials, because we're putting those studies then at risk. If somebody is coming in with COVID, both our people on our site are at risk, those that are going to be seeing the participants, but also the participants in those other trials could be at risk unless there's measures taken to keep separation between units. So what we like to do with those studies is to find other sites that are already working on COVID vaccines or those types of trials so that we're not risking other studies with bringing in the COVID trials. Since the pandemic, there's been an increase in research or interest in cold and flu studies, immune function studies, and of course COVID trials. That's not to say that other research isn't being done. I think the entire sector of preventative health has actually seen an increase in interest both from consumer demand as well as interest from those companies producing those products to put more research behind their products, understanding the importance that they actually play in global healthcare. So we've shifted from, of course, drugs for treatment to now a much greater interest in preventative measures.